Thank you, Allison. Welcome. It's so good to see so many students, especially those that I got so excited with this morning about our event tonight. It is my pleasure to introduce our guest. Masha Gessen is a Russian-American journalist and author of 11 books, including The Man Without a Face, The Unlikely Rise of Vladimir Putin, The Future is History, How Totalitarianism Reclaimed Russia, which won the National Book Award in 2017, and most recently, Surviving Autocracy. Those are only 3 of the 11 books, but they are among my favorites, so I thought I'd mention them. You may know Gessen's work from the New York Times, where they are an opinion columnist, numerous works in the New Yorker and other places that I'm sure you frequently read. They are a distinguished professor at the Craig Newmark Graduate School of Journalism at the City University of New York, a distinguished visiting writer at Bard College, and the recipient of numerous awards, too many to name now. Welcome back to Colby. It is my pleasure to turn the floor over to you, and please, one more welcome to Masha Gessen.
Thank you. It's great to be here.
Christina will ask the first question, and then I will have the second question, and we'll see how the time looks and open it up to the floor. So please, Christina, go ahead.
It's an honor to have you here. As a student from Moldova, post-Soviet country, I'm particularly fascinated by your professional journey. Your extensive career reporting from Russia and covering a wide range of topics: Russia, Ukraine, Israel, Palestine, Trump, LGBTQ activism, and political violence. All this has been incredibly inspiring to follow. I'm especially curious about your experiences or decision you feel were most pivotal in bringing you to this moment in your career. And do you think there is a thread that connects all of your work? And what do you look for when pitching a story?
Okay, that's many questions. Let's.
Quite a few.
Well, first of all, it's great to be here. I love this format. I've never seen anything like this before, but I'm very excited to participate in this. So let's choose one question. Maybe what I look for when in pitching a story. I mean, I don't. Columnists don't actually pitch stories, but when I'm looking for a story that I want to work on, there are a couple of things. One is it's something that I want to spend my time with. Right? It's most pronounced actually when I'm thinking about a book. Like, is it something, or someone, if I'm writing about someone, is it someone that I can see myself living with for 2 years? Right? Not in a literal sense, but it can be a very distant someone. Like when I wrote a book about Grigory Perelman, who is a Russian mathematician who proved the Poincare conjecture, and was this famous recluse, which is a contradiction, which is part of what drew me to him. And it was an interesting puzzle to solve, but it turned out that living with him for a year and a half was not appealing. I mean, I wrote the book, but I was miserable writing the book. And weirdly, when I was very resistant to the idea of writing about Putin for quite a long time. But then when I finally started writing about Putin, I actually enjoyed it quite a lot. Not because he's such an appealing character, which he obviously is not, but because I felt like at that point I had accumulated so much knowledge and had done so much reporting that just the joy of systematizing something and putting together a picture that I felt at that point no one had put together, and really trying to prove it almost like a mathematical problem was actually very, very enjoyable. So, but I didn't answer your question about stories, because stories are a little bit, there's so many variables, right? It's something that interests me. It's something that I feel like I have something to say about that other people wouldn't say. If I think that one of my colleagues would probably write a perfectly good column on this very topic. I'm not going to do it. I don't. They'll probably write a better column if they have the sort of a similar take on it. So a lot of the time, I'm writing about things that I have particular access to, or I think I have a particular angle on that other people are not going to have.
Just follow up on part of Christina's question. You just mentioned, Masha, this particular angle. And given the 20 plus years you spent in Russia, Soviet Union prior to that, I wondered if that gives you a perspective, if you see something that maybe we don't see when you are choosing stories, or when you decide to accept an invitation to a college to talk about current events. Can you maybe say something about that?
Yeah. Well, so to give you an idea of my background, I actually was born in Moscow. My family immigrated to this country when I was 14. I became a journalist here, and then I went back when I was 24, and I thought I'd go back for a few years of reporting on the Soviet Union as it was falling apart, and I stayed for 22 years. So I've spent most of my life and most of my adult life in Russia, but I've also had this entire time, I had a career as a Russian journalist, but I also, this entire time, had a career as an American journalist and author. So it's a weird way of straddling two worlds, and I think that that's probably something that helps me a lot. And I think there's things that are specific to my experience in Russia that are helpful in getting an angle, but I also think there are things that are general to just having the experience of more than one country. Czeslaw Milosz has, was it Czeslaw? Yeah, it was Czeslaw Milosz who wrote an essay. I'm sorry? No, an essay called "In Praise of Exile," and it's really about that. It's about this the experience of displacement that gives you an ability to question everything. It's like I was driving with my kid and his best friend the other day, and the best friend is 11 years old and incredibly articulate and very, very cool. And he was like, "Why do you ever think, why do we invent these things that just become incredibly corrupt and then we live with them?" And I can't remember whether we were talking about the election or the school board or something, right? But something that this description fit perfectly. But it's that childlike ability to ask, why do we invent these things? And then naturalize them and live with them without questioning them, that I think is also the strength of an outsider of any kind, right? An exile or somebody who moves between worlds. And then what's specific to just my experience in Russia is I spent decades reporting on how an autocracy is constructed, how it comes apart, how it comes back together. And I don't necessarily think that that's the best background for thinking about and writing about Donald Trump. I think there are probably better countries that would prepare you for Trump. Like I suspect that Italy or Israel would actually be, the countries that are functional democracies that fall in thrall with a strong man, right? Whose contempt for the system is part of his seduction. That's not the case in Russia at all, but it is. But there are other countries where it's culturally very, very clear, and yet, I think that reporting on Putin also gave me a kind of special optics that allowed me to write things in 2016 that people were coming around to understanding a couple of years later.
Thank you. I would still like to pose my first question. and I'm particularly interested in the politics of memory, as you know, and as many of my students know, and the construction of narratives or stories about the past to inform the present. I'm thinking about your book, Surviving Autocracy, and I wanted to ask, what are the narratives of us, as you put it in that book, the stories being told about who is we, that you're hearing in this American presidential campaign, and why are those stories significant?
That's such a good question. Can I answer the opposite question, though? Can I answer the question about what I'm not hearing? Because I think that actually the absences are more striking to me at this point. We're not hearing the story of the nation of immigrants at all. It's vanished. Which it was a highly problematic narrative, right? Of course, we know that this is a nation of immigrants and a nation of settler colonialists and a nation of slaves, but that story had incredible narrative power, and it had power that enabled people to act humanely and to act in accordance with international law by relying on the story that this country has served as a safe haven for millions of people historically. And the disappearance of that historic aspiration, I think, is really scary. We're not even relying on it to resist the slander of Haitian immigrants in Springfield, Ohio, right? It's just gone. And a story that is less that has never been fully present, I think, in this country, but that I was really hoping to hear when Tim Walz first came on the scene, and that I think has some sort of precedence in American history, was a story of neighborliness and mutual care and mutual aid. This is clearly a governor who's built his reputation on a politics of care. And when he first emerged, I thought, oh, this is great. This is really going to work. This is, if they start telling the story, then that will be an answer to what is Trump's greatest strength. And Trump's greatest strength is not even trafficking, I'm convinced, not even trafficking in xenophobic rhetoric, although that's a great strength of his, but speaking more fundamentally, right? Speaking to the anxieties that people feel. And the antidote to that, I think, would be a politics of care. And we're not hearing that story. I just before coming here heard Kamala Harris give a really great, competent, and policy-wise very, very good, especially given how little time she's had to formulate policy, speech on economics in Pittsburgh. But that wasn't there.
So I promise there would be a question about media. And since we are talking about stories, I was thinking about how platforms like Telegram has been used by Russia as a digital front in its war against Ukraine. They have been employing war correspondents and state media to manipulate narratives. And I was wondering, since we live in a world where social media plays a significant role in shaping public opinion of public perceptions of autocratic threats and spreading disinformation, how do you view the evolving relationship between social media and journalism and counteracting misinformation and promoting factual reporting?
So I don't think that social media have sort of endemic traits, right? you mentioned Telegram and the way that the Russian government has weaponized Telegram. There are a lot of other actors who have weaponized Telegram, and the reason they've been able to do it is because it's basically completely unregulated. Even it's not even as regulated as a social media platform such as Facebook, which is also basically unregulated. But I think we're still limited by language and geography. That may change. But at this point, social media, I think, reflect and accelerate and amplify things that are present offline. And what is present offline in this country is very different from what's present offline, for now, very different from what's present offline in Russia. So in Russia, the media sphere is completely fragmented. Anybody, somebody might be reading the so-called war correspondents who are war propagandists, empowered and sometimes employed by the Russian government, and nothing else. Right? Or they may be, as we know, a lot of media consumers in Russia are just watching entertainment on TV and tuning out everything else that's going on. The media sphere in the United States is fragmented in a different way. It's fragmented. First of all, it's not nearly as fragmented as it is in Russia, but it's fragmented politically. But people are likely to be consuming things in their sort of part of the political spectrum on various platforms. And so the way that social media interact with traditional media is that they help a bubbling up and a trickling down effect. And that's actually a great thing. That's the way that local media used to function. That's the way community media used to function. Not that there's anything good about local media and community media having gone by the wayside, but at least some of that is present on social media. So a story will appear, will gain traction, bubble up to conventional media, and then trickle back down to social media from the reporting that conventional media have done. I actually think that's a pretty great thing. That doesn't address your question about disinformation, because I don't know how to talk about it. Like disinformation, sort of among people who study media, disinformation is not considered to be a terribly useful term because it just covers everything at once. It covers people who create, like J.D. Vance and Springfield, Ohio are an example of disinformation. But also Russian disinformation campaigns are an example of disinformation. But also people buying up disused web domains and populating them with AI-generated content, creating content farms, is also disinformation. So it's, there would have to get more specific to talk about what happens on social media with stuff that's wrong.
I wanted to shift back a bit to the theme of autocracy. And you've written extensively about the impact of autocracy on personal freedoms. And I wondered if you have seen, if you're concerned about some similar dynamics in contemporary democracies. If there are one or two places where you are concerned about, the impact, the way the law is used to curb personal freedoms, for example.
Well, I think we're seeing it all the time. We're not, with probably the best example of a parallel between an autocracy and a democracy are American book bans. When a community using often democratic means bans access to certain literature for the rest of the community, imposes censorship, makes it an infraction, if not necessarily a crime, to be distributing or consuming these books. That reminds me of my childhood.
Thank you. I think it's time to go to student questions. And I believe the first question goes to Julia Dunn. So here comes a microphone for you, Julia. So everyone else start thinking about your questions.
Thank you. Thank you so much for being here. I'm Julia. I'm a sophomore, and I'm a government and global studies major. So on the NPR Throughline episode, The Anatomy of Autocracy from January 28th, 2021, you said, we've lived through an autocratic attempt for 4 years, and Donald Trump has been trying to stage an autocratic breakthrough. Given the autocratic threat of Donald Trump that you mentioned in this podcast and the current world trend of weakening democracies, what do you think would be the impact of a second Donald Trump term on the international system and the possibility for cooperation within it?
Right. What a depressing question. So let me first clarify the terms. I'm using terms that were introduced by a Hungarian social scientist named Balint Magyar, who has done incredible work on the taxonomy of post-Soviet autocracies. And I realized when and his initial approach was, he's Hungarian, so he's living in Hungary. He's looking at what's happening with Viktor Orban's initial reversal of Hungarian democratic gains, and he's thinking that political science has no way to describe what's happening. And the way he's a very witty man, and the way he put it to me the first time I interviewed him, which was many, many years ago, he said, well, you know, we talk about liberal freedoms. We talk about, freedom of speech, or freedom of the press, or free and fair elections. And then we say we don't have them. And that's totally uninformative. It's like saying that the elephant can't fly and the elephant can't swim. And what does that tell you about the elephant? And so he set out to create a vocabulary and basically a system of thought about post-communist countries, and then after that about what was happening to them as they reversed democratic gains. And so he has this complicated system that really works. Like he predicted, when everybody thought that Poland was going to go the way of Hungary and Russia and Belarus, he said, no, that's not what's happening there. They're just they're having a retrenchment, but it's not following any of the same patterns. And he was right. But anyway, his one of his very the reason I'm going into some detail was because I found myself when I was trying to write a small book about the Trump administration, I found myself in a similar position. I felt like we didn't have the language to describe what Trump was doing. And I thought, well, maybe I can sort of, with lots of caveats, try to apply Magyar's framework to what's happening under Trump. And then when I started applying it, I realized it was really applicable. Like that language was super useful. And part of the, one of the things in his language that's super useful was this chronology that he proposes. That first there's an autocratic attempt when somebody comes in, somebody who's democratically elected, and starts destroying the system. And then, and that autocratic attempt lasts until there's an autocratic breakthrough. And the autocratic breakthrough is the point where autocratic gains cannot be reversed by electoral means. So for example, in Hungary, Viktor Orban, who by the way, served a term in office, then was out of office for 2 terms, and then came back and staged his autocratic breakthrough. And that was passing a new constitution. And that there's no, if Orban goes, if his entire party goes, there's no mechanism for undoing that constitution. It would take basically a revolution to do it. And so then following the autocratic breakthrough, there's autocratic consolidation. Now that it's an actually changed system, the autocrat consolidates new mechanisms of wielding power that make it even harder to reverse. So that's a very long answer to a very simple question, but I think, but the ultimate answer is also quite simple. I think if Donald Trump is elected again, there will be an autocratic breakthrough.
Well, on that happy note, let me go to Brendan here in the front, and then you in the green sweatshirt, and someone in the back table. I'll come back to you.
Hi, my name is Brendan. I'm a double major in government and German studies. And when talking about autocratic movements around the world, you briefly mentioned Israel, which is something that's really interesting to me because that's not a formulation I think we hear enough about Netanyahu and Israel. So I wanted to hear your thoughts on how you characterize Netanyahu's government and maybe as one of these authoritarian movements in the same light.
That's a great point that we don't usually, and in fact, people notice that when I use Netanyahu sort of in example lists in Surviving Autocracy, people notice that not that anybody argued with it, but that we don't usually refer to Israel as one of those countries. But it is, and some of the hallmarks are, of course, how long Netanyahu has been in power. I think we have to be suspicious of anybody who stays in power for over a decade, and certainly anybody who stays in power for more than 2 decades. I think we've also seen, certainly his judicial reform, which has not fully succeeded, but that was a clear autocratic attempt. Right? And his autocratic attempt has been much slower than many other countries, but comparable actually to Hungary. Right? That took a while. But this is what they do. They autocrats who come to power in countries with functioning democratic mechanisms will go after the judiciary because that's the biggest check on them. And Donald Trump did that too by packing the federal judiciary, including but not limited to the Supreme Court. And we're certainly seeing the consequences of that. And I think a third thing that's a little bit harder to sort of quantify, it's more of a qualitative measure, but how much Israel has moved to the right under his governments, successive governments. And I don't know, I can certainly see theoretically making the argument that somebody who moves a country just as far to the left we should probably be also very suspicious of. But what was, to think about, say, the mid-1990s, after the murder of Yitzhak Rabin, when who was murdered by somebody, not a settler, but somebody who was very much defending Israeli settlements in the West Bank and Gaza. And at the time, the entire country perceived that young man as not just an extremist because he murdered Rabin, but as a representative of an extreme fringe point of view. And now all the positions that he espoused are basically espoused by the government, the vast majority of politicians, and the vast majority of the population. Right? And that sort of 30 years, or less than 30 years, is a really small amount of time in which to see something that was viewed as absolutely extreme and almost unthinkable become the political mainstream. And so I think that's another telltale sign that something has gone very awry in Israel because something has shifted so much.
Okay, if you could remind us, it's Will, right, of your name and yeah.
I'm Wilson, I'm a sophomore. When we learn about Russia, I think we typically hear of Putin's Russia or the Soviet Union, but I don't think it really gets to the essence of the spirit, the mores of Russia. So knowing that Russian literature is among the most beautiful in the world, who's your favorite author, and in your favorite work that really captures the spirit of Russia?
I like that question. So probably I would now say that my favorite author, subject to change, is. But I always, it's so funny. It's probably because I'm a writer that question about what's your favorite book or who's your favorite writer strikes me as incredibly intimate. So my honest answer is Lydia Tchaikovskaya, who most people have, not just in this country, but probably in Russia, haven't heard of. But she was an absolutely incredible writer of both fiction and nonfiction. Definitely one of her novels, called Sofia Petrovna, has been translated into English. And from what I understand, even though I don't think it's her best work, and translations are always questionable undertakings, but from what I understand, it's quite effective in English as well. But I really think that she, all of her writing in some way or another is fiction, nonfiction, and very creative nonfiction, on the nature of political terror. Right? And I don't think there's a writer, dead or alive, who has captured the essence of political terror the same way that she has. I know that's not necessarily the most appealing recommendation, but that's what it is.
In keeping with the theme, there was some nodding going on in the balcony, or the second tier here, about the author and the works, but too bad you can't ask questions. Anyway, did you still want to pose a question? And when the microphone reaches you, if you could tell us your name and this back table here. Hello. See? And then others percolating with questions. Okay.
Hi, my name's Lily. I'm a freshman. So what advantages and disadvantages have you found in a career as a journalist who straddles two worlds, as you said? And what kinds of insights does this give you into how America impacts the rest of the world, especially in the upcoming election, or even insights on America itself that the public and US-based journalists might not see?
Honestly, I've had a charmed career. So I think that being able to go to the Soviet Union to report in 1991 and speaking the language was just an incredible stroke of luck. It really was the most interesting place in the world. And there were a lot of foreign correspondents there for whom it was also a once-in-a-generation story. But I think that just the fact that I was from there, that I knew people, and that, again, I spoke the language, and that I could blend in and just be invisible and just live the story. Unfortunately, as one gets older and better known, this ability to blend in tends to disappear, and that's the biggest disadvantage of having a charmed career. But the other thing that you asked about, what insights has it given me into the United States? I already alluded to this, that when Trump was first running for office, I could tell, and he's obviously very different from Putin. He is temperamentally completely different. He's just all emotion, and Putin prides himself on never showing any emotion. Trump is a really gifted orator, and Putin is anything but a gifted orator. And Trump is a very fast mover. Putin is a very slow-moving autocrat. And yet, there was something in what he was proposing as his vision of power. In fact, what you could tell was his definition of political power that was instantly recognizable to me. And so I could say, and this is something that I wrote early on, this guy is not running for president. This guy is running for autocrat. He's telling us as much. And you know, I'm a big admirer of investigative journalists. I think they do incredible stuff, especially these days or the last few years when data mining and data analysis has given us just like incredible insights into the world. But I'm a really big believer in just looking at the thing that's right in front of you and thinking about it hard, and not trying to dig up secrets, because usually what we need to know is right there. And so having the background to be able to think about it hard and make comparisons, I think has been hugely beneficial.
Hi, I'm Rhea. I'm a freshman here at Colby. My question for you is, how do you reconcile with the emergence of echo chambers in both traditional and...
I'm sorry, can I ask you to slow down?
I'm sorry. How do you reconcile the growing echo chambers in both traditional media and social media with the growing extremism on the political spectrum?
I'm sorry, I can't understand what you're asking. I'm so sorry.
How do you reconcile the growing emergence of echo chambers in traditional sources of media, social media with growing extremism, and the rhetoric that is coming forth from policymakers? And do you think that the way our media is structured now is leading to a growing need for extremist policies? And do you think these policies are showing a trend towards more autocratic structures?
Okay, first of all, I apologize for interrupting you. I'm trying to make sense of that question. That's a bit of a leading question. It's basically like a yes or no question. Can you try to rephrase it?
We could go to another question while you think about it, or we think about it. Would that be all right? Yeah. Good. There's a lot of interesting stuff in that question. Yeah. We'll maybe come back to that. Thank you. Do you want to pass the microphone to your table mate there with his hand up? Thank you.
Thank you very much. My name's Thor Gabrielson. I'm a junior and a math major. I guess my question is, a lot of time we're talking about autocracy, we talk about like Orban's Hungary or Trump's America or so on. I guess the question is, how important is the individual in that? Like, if Donald Trump just never decided to run in 2015, would someone have come in his place within a decade or so? Or like, is it more like the conditions of the country or the individual person is kind of what I'm asking? Thank you.
Yeah, it's a great question, and I think the answer is it's both. I think that Trump was an unprecedented candidate, but he was an unprecedented candidate who would have been unthinkable maybe 8 years earlier, even 4 years earlier, right? Certainly 20 years earlier. So I think there were conditions that developed that enabled somebody like Trump to run and succeed. And of course, as you may recall, when he first announced his candidacy, a lot of people still thought he was unthinkable and didn't take him seriously, which reflected, I think, their lack of understanding of the conditions that he was speaking to. So there's a kind of tautological proof there that you need both circumstances and a person to combine at a particular moment.
Okay, so following, keeping in line with this side of the room, we'll make our way to the other side of the room. Yes, go ahead, Zane, and introduce yourself, etc. Do you have the microphone?
Hi, I'm Zane. I'm a junior government major. Since the fall of the Soviet Union, most of the U.S. attention has shifted to China as the largest hegemonic rival. What lessons do you think we should take from the Cold War as we look forward to a new one?
Yeah, I'm not a China expert. My biggest reaction always to questions about China is there's something terribly wrong with the State Department that or with the presidential administration that basically devotes half a page in its original policy documents to Russia, and pages upon pages on China. So maybe the biggest lesson that we need to take from the Cold War is actually a larger lesson of history, which is that it does not repeat itself. We're not going into another Cold War. The current world situation is different. There is definitely a giant hegemonic power that is a rival and, in fact, a superior rival to the United States in many respects. But there's also Russia, which is which is willing basically to die as a country to reclaim its place as a pole in this contemporary world. And so this is a totally new geometry, and it would be a huge mistake to continue to think in bipolar terms with just a substitute for Russia.
Okay, great. Good idea. We got this. Okay.
Where do you get your news from, and how can we avoid falling into echo chambers as we consume the news?
Thank you. That's actually a great question. So, I just was telling Jen before we went on stage that I'm teaching a course at the journalism school about getting it wrong, and the first essay that we read in that course is an essay that Walter Lippmann and Charles Mars wrote about how the New York Times missed the Russian Revolution, and the essay was published more than 100 years ago. And it's kind of amazing to read because just they're so smart and their analysis of the media is so moving, and also really depressing to read because you could basically substitute different words and names and apply it to the stories that we miss now. But one of the things that, one of the dichotomies that they propose in this essay is the dichotomy between a casual reader and a sophisticated reader. And the casual reader is clearly somebody who reads headlines, captions, maybe the lead, the first paragraph of the story. And that reader gets, in their opinion, and they show, or in their analysis, and their analysis is very convincing, that reader got a completely erroneous picture of what was happening in Russia through the entire revolutionary year of 1917. The sophisticated reader reads between the lines, reads to the end of the story, analyzes not only the story itself, but the pattern of coverage, asks questions such as, why does the New York Times consider it necessary to keep reassuring me that there will be no revolution in Russia? Does that mean there will be a revolution in Russia? Not an unreasonable thing for a sophisticated reader to ask, but the lesson of that is that we can't create media for sophisticated readers because none of us can actually afford to be sophisticated readers on all topics. That would be a full-time job and probably more. And there's a huge responsibility that that attaches to headlines, leads, captions, social media captions these days, often written by people who maybe skimmed the story, who probably have to post 10 times within 1 hour and have to make up 10 of these captions on topics that they don't fully understand. So I think that in this sense, our media sphere has been degraded even further for the casual reader, which doesn't answer your question about where I get my news from, but answers your question about how I think about all the sort of inherent dangers and the mistakes that we make as creators of media constantly, right? So I have all the breaking news alerts on my phone. That's the New York Times, the Wall Street Journal, the Washington Post. I will, and Haaretz, the Israeli newspaper, and TV Rain, the Russian independent television channel, and Meduza, which is another Russian independent outlet in exile. So obviously I can't even read all of those headlines. Right? I kind of keep them coming as in the course of the day, hoping that I'm at least following the general gist of all the news all the time. I will at least a couple of times a day scroll to the right on my phone so that I can see the Google News headlines that Google has picked out for me. Not a great curator of news, but it will sometimes pop up with a New York Post story that I wouldn't ordinarily come across. But I also depend a lot on my colleagues. If somebody thinks of a story highly enough to post a link to it on a Slack channel, I will definitely go and read that story. Like I'm reading a story right now on the Marshall Project. Do people know what the Marshall Project is? It's a nonprofit media outlet devoted entirely to law enforcement and incarceration. And it's really, really well done. So there's this amazing story on how the Florida, Parkdale, right? What was the school? Parkdale? Parkland. Thank you, Parkland. How the Parkland shooter, how his defense team worked, and how they made the case against the death penalty in his case. Not a story that I ever would have come across on my own, but it's blowing my mind. I'm only about 50% through it. I highly recommend it. So there's no substitute, actually. I mean, the Slack channel is a substitute, but there's still no substitute for talking to your friends and family and loved ones about the news. That's how you get to cross-pollinate a little bit.
I've been looking in this direction the entire time. I'm going to move my neck to this side. I'm going to try to get someone who I don't think has had a question in this series, maybe? Okay, yes, please. Tell us your name.
Oh yeah, hi, I'm Peter and I'm a government major. So, as someone whose father's side of my family is actually from Springfield, Ohio, I found it very interesting what you said before on how social media is being used as a tool to kind of boil up small stories and disseminate them at a national level where they will eventually boil down. But I can't help but feel that we now live in an era where stories, instead of boiling down, boil over, such as a recent bomb threat made at a university in Springfield. So my question for you is, how can we as both young people and consumers of social and mass media combat misinformation and start working towards boiling false information down instead of over?
That's a really good question and incredibly well phrased counter to my description of how media works. But I think the problem is individuals can't do it, not even well-organized groups of individuals. We need, at the very least, government regulation of social media, of conventional media. I mean, we have had, we've never had fully regulated media in this country the way that most Western democracies have. And we've never had a public media the way that most Western democracies have. But the deregulated media sphere that we live in now is only about 30 years old. Before 35 years old. Before the advent of cable news and the disappearance of the fairness doctrine, which required broadcasters to maintain a kind of political balance, but which relied on this assumption that, so the reason that we got rid of the fairness doctrine was that there had been an assumption that broadcast frequencies were a limited resource. And the government had to regulate the use of this limited resource so that different political parties could have equal access to this limited resource. Cable news and cable channels was an unlimited resource. And so the government said, okay, we're backing out of this. We no longer have to regulate it. The problem, of course, is not with whether broadcast frequencies or cable channels are limited or unlimited. The problem is that our attention is limited. Human attention is a limited resource. And we need rules for how profit-seeking companies lay claim to human attention. That is not a way that we're used to thinking. It's much closer to the way that that societies where media have traditionally been much more regulated are used to thinking, but it's really anathema to the way Americans think about freedom of speech. But if you start to reframe freedom of speech as freedom to be, not just to say something, but freedom to hear, then you realize that you need somebody to make order in a very regulated, very limited way, to make order of what even gets to lay claim to your attention. So as much as I want individuals to be media literate, the real problem is not with individuals, it's not with consumers, it's with the government basically falling down on the job.
Ira and Elisabetta, if we have time.
Hi, I'm Ira. I'm a senior. I'm a global studies major. I read your article a couple of months ago in the New York Times about the Evan Gershkovich hostage release situation and the connections to Alexei Navalny. And what really struck me about that article was how deeply personal it felt. I mean, how could it not be? But I wanted to ask, given also your comments about how your charmed career has led to certain advantages and disadvantages, how do you kind of deal with the growing blending of your personal life and your career as a journalist?
So, you know, there's some contradictory currents in thinking about journalism. A very traditional way of thinking about journalism is that journalists should be disinterested observers. It's what in media studies is called the view from nowhere. But of course, the term the view from nowhere suggests its own impossibility. All of us are somewhere. And frankly, I don't think that people should write about things that they don't care about, because they don't care about them. And how am I going to care about something that the writer doesn't care about? I think that, and in my professional lifetime, there have been such huge changes in the way that even conventional media approach this issue of impartiality. When I was a young journalist, it was a black journalist would not have been sent to cover civil rights protests. A gay journalist wouldn't have been sent to cover gay and lesbian rights protests, which is what they were called at the time. And now we think of that as absurd. Like, of course, we think that representation in the newsroom is a value, not a liability. And of course we would send a black journalist to cover a Black Lives Matter protest and to cover the larger issue of police brutality against black men, etc. So, you know, it's all personal. There are issues for me as a writer, of course, when I'm writing about something that is emotional. But fortunately, I find that to be a useful outlet. Like when things are really horrible, like when Alexei Navalny died, thank God I could write his obituary. Like I didn't have to keep it all bottled up and just feels. It's an antidote to feeling helpless. And so I think that's what you note very rightly about that story. That's also present there.
Oh.
Hi, I'm Elizaveta. I am a second-year student studying government and economics, and I would like to put my question in the context of how many independent news sources in Russia have been declared foreign agents, have forced government restrictions, and have either been exiled or self-exiled. Despite that, many of them still continue to exist, either on a smaller scale or operating from abroad. What are the most effective forms, do you think, of media production and dissemination that empower these independent news sources to continue their work from abroad or from these much smaller, more restricted scales? And do you think there are more innovative ways that they can adapt their storytelling in this new climate?
Nice sweatshirt. I think that, you know, what we have seen in the last 2.5 years with Russian media in exile has been absolutely remarkable. They basically, within a week of the full-scale invasion of Ukraine in February 2022, Russia passed military censorship laws that made it illegal to report on the war and to call the war a war, to use any information that comes from any source other than the general staff. I myself have been sentenced in absentia to 8 years in prison for quote-unquote spreading false information about the Russian armed forces for my reporting from Ukraine. And so anybody who wanted to continue working as a journalist, including entire media outlets, had to leave the country, and they did. What's extraordinary about what they do, and there are many other countries whose journalists are in similar situations. They've also had to go into exile. Venezuelan media are in exile. Guatemalan media are in exile. But an extraordinary thing about Russian media in exile is that they're covering a war where they don't have physical access to either side of the war. As Russians, most of them, with just a couple of exceptions, can't go into Ukraine. And they can't go into Russia because they will get arrested. So given that, they've done, or even not given that, but in those circumstances, they've done incredible work, including work that only Russian journalists could do. Like, for example, getting Russian officers on active duty to confess to war crimes on their cell phone cameras while this was being recorded by TV Rain in Riga. and to be then compiled into a news report, but then also it will go, I am sure, one day to The Hague and serve as evidence of war crimes. So far be it for me to teach them or suggest better ways of doing things. I think they've really, they're heroes, and they've been unbelievably inventive. I temper my excitement with the fact that most people in Russia don't know that they're doing this. Many people in Russia who even want to have access to these media outlets can't, even though technologically they've also been very, very inventive. They've put their stuff on YouTube, which is still accessible probably for a few more weeks. In Russia, they create apps that are hidden on your phone, but that don't require a VPN in order for you to be able to read a publication. I mean, they're like doing really great stuff. And they're reaching millions of people, which is totally remarkable, but it's a couple of million people in a country of 145.
Well, I want to thank students for your questions. They were all really great questions, and I'm sorry we didn't get to more of them. But your questions and your responses gave us so much to think about, so thought-provoking. And these can feel like very dark days sometimes, very heavy, and your work is so inspiring. What you do gives me great hope. Tough to subjects, but the risks that you take, the way in which you raise awareness is so important. So thank you for being here. Please join me one more time in expressing our appreciation.
Thank you. Thank you, Jen. Thank you, Christina.
Thank you all so much. Thank you. That was an amazing conversation. Students, thank you. I think there's still some food left.